Good afternoon. Who's really excited to be here? Can we, okay. Well, I want to first of all thank you all for just joining us for today's panel on how Chicago shaped Barack and Michelle Obama. My name is Kaden Nix, and I'm a sophomore at the University of Chicago, studying public policy with interest in health policy and comparative social policy. I also serve on the Public Policy Studies Student Advisory Board, and within the IOP, my interaction has ranged from civic engagement to fellow seminars and speaker series events. This summer, I had the privilege of participating in the pilot hometown internship program offered through our very own IOP, where me and some of my brilliant peers will take our grit and commitment to serve the communities where we grew up. It's time for me to give that friendly reminder, so please nudge the person next to you who's on their phone. Silence or turn them off, just to be courteous to other attendees. During the latter half of today's panel, there will be a microphone placed in the audience. If this is your first time at least, please ask the question that comes to mind. This is a place where conversation really never stops, and you don't know where one question may lead. So this is an unfriendly nudge to just do it. And as always, we give priority to questions for students. And we also encourage you to register for our final speaker series event of the year, Countdown to November, the Race for the White House, which will feature David Axelrod and will take place in the IOP backyard at 12:30 p.m. on Friday, May 17th. For students who have IOP opportunities this summer, there will be upcoming programming on Summer in Chicago and Summer in Washington, or I guess in your case, if you're doing the hometown program, it will be over Zoom. So moderating today's discussion is the splendid filmmaker and former director of the IOP Pritzker Fellows Program, Alicia Sams. Joining her will be Professor Adam Green, an esteemed associate professor, historian, and political thinker at the University of Chicago, and author of Selling the Race, Culture and Community in Black Chicago. His research has worked to propel a portrayal of Black Chicago for the resilience and cultural epicenter that it is. Susan Sher is an attorney by trade who was a co-worker of Mrs. Obama at the UChicago Medicine, where they became really good friends. She later served as chief of staff to the First Lady and assistant to the 44th President of the United States. She now serves as a senior advisor to the President of the University of Chicago and its liaison for the Obama Foundation. And last but certainly not least, we have David Axelrod, who I personally share a lot in common with. For starters, we have both been sophomores at the University of Chicago. We are both here today, and he'll be pretty embarrassed for me to admit this on behalf of both of us, but we're both here for the food, and we might stay for the politics. That's still undecided. But all jokes aside, Mr. Axelrod is a renowned journalist, former chief strategist to the Obama presidential campaigns, and former senior advisor to President Obama. He is also, of course, the founding director of the Institute of Politics, a nonpartisan hub that works to nurture the university's commitment to rigorous academics and free expression by affording us the toolbox and network that is critical for a lifetime of public service. I'm definitely excited, so let's go ahead and give me just a warm welcome to our panelists.
Thank you. We are almost twins.
Good walk-on music. So, welcome everybody. It's really nice to see you here on a rainy afternoon. We are here to talk about the Obama Oral History Project, which I've had a sneak peek at, and it's really an amazing collection of interviews. I did go down the rabbit hole. It's addictive. And I think the Chicago ones, which are the only ones I've had a peek at, are especially interesting because the personal and political narratives are so deeply intertwined here, and there's so many people that knew the Obamas before the nation knew the Obamas. So I want to start with Susan. and ask her sort of, can you describe what the Obama Oral History Project is and what was the goal of the Chicago interviews, how it all came to be?
Sure. It's pretty customary to have an oral history, an official oral history of a presidential administration. The Miller Center and University of Virginia has done many of them, but in this case, the Obama Foundation decided to hire Columbia University for this oral history project because they have a lot of expertise in oral history. They even have a master's in oral history, which is kind of unusual. They had done a very well-respected oral history after 9/11. So they have conducted 400 or so interviews about the Obama administration. But they and the Obama Foundation agreed that it would be important also to cover other aspects of the Obama's life. So the University of Hawaii was asked to do the oral history of President Obama's early life, and the University of Chicago was asked if we were interested in focusing on the Obamas, both of them, the Obamas' rise as leaders in Chicago. And we were very excited about this project. And very fortunately, I reached out first to Professor Green, who is an expert on US history, African American history, and he immediately agreed. And then the other person I reached out to who couldn't be here today is Professor Jackie Stewart, who is a professor in cinema studies, film studies, and some of you saw her on Turner Classics because she was the host. She now is the director of the Oscars Museum, so she couldn't be here, but she did many of the interviews as well. Her expertise was more in oral history, and one of her projects was the South Side Home Movie Project, where she was able to gather and preserve home movies of South Side residents, and then she actually conducted oral histories of many of the residents who had made these movies. So we had a great group, and Columbia gave us training about the way they wanted us to approach it. And the first huge piece of it, Professor Green conducted, which was really they call it a blueprint, but it was to go over the themes that he felt and we all agreed were really important. And then from that, we had categories of people we thought we should interview. Personal, professional, political, organizing, and then institutional university people. And our team was rounded out by Alice McLean, who's here somewhere, who kept our weekly meetings going and organized. Then we hired some University of Chicago students, from undergraduates to graduate students to postgrads, and we came up with about 23 or so people we thought needed to be interviewed. They created bios of each of them in great detail. They went over all of the kind of public record on each, and from that, Professors Green and Stewart did outlines, which we went over on a weekly basis to sort of go over what we thought were the important things to cover. And then this was the beginning of COVID, so all but one of these interviews were done on Zoom. Hopefully they will be available to everyone within the next several months, and we're looking forward to that.
So, Professor Green, these go back to Michelle's birth and 40 years to President Obama's first job in Chicago. I'm going to start there. At age 23, he's fresh out of college, fresh-ish. Can you just set the stage a little bit for what the Chicago that Barack Obama arrived in 1985 looked like? He came as a community organizer for the Developing Community Projects. What did he encounter? I just want to get a sense of the Chicago that existed when the story begins.
Well, Chicago, and I would certainly defer to both of my fellow panelists, was always a colorful place. There were struggles, fights, controversies, larger than life personalities, and that went into making the legend both of Chicago politics. Of course, Harold Washington was at that point halfway through his first term, And as Barack Obama began to go more into the Developing Communities Project term that he had as director of that program, he saw more developments that related to the Washington administration. So there's that part of the story. It was a city that established institutions were beginning to be challenged in some very significant ways. Of course, the Democratic machine that was based in Cook County, and I think a range of other power centers. But I also think it was a very dynamic city. It was a city that was, in part because of the Washington administration, really reckoning with the consequence of segregation, really reckoning with the consequence of deindustrialization, really thinking about the ways in which some communities were plugged in and some communities were very much on the side. And it probably is important to mention that not only was Barack Obama organizing on the South Side in relation to communities that were predominantly African American and Latinx, he was organizing on the far, far South Side. He was down in Roseland. He was down in the areas of South Chicago. They were dealing with enormous issues, for instance, in terms of the problems of locating waste disposal sites and issues of environmental justice that related to public housing. And getting those issues on the radar of even a sympathetic administration like the Washington administration was actually difficult. And I think that what it points to, if I can kind of close this up, was that Chicago was in some ways a city in flux. It was trying to think about how policy would be conducted going forward by city governments. It was trying to think about where ideas came in relation to approaching community organizing. Somebody who's actually very important in the story is John McKnight and his philosophy of thinking about seeing community organizing in relation to inventorying community assets, as much as thinking about the deficits and the struggles and the obstacles that communities faced. And I think in some ways, Barack Obama was in part inspired and informed by that philosophy and always approached the people that he was working with in terms of his organizing work as partners and allies and sources of knowledge and work in their own right. But a fair amount was up in the air. And I think that that actually became something of a leitmotif in terms of talking about Chicago, was that Chicago was in the process of reconfiguring. And in its reconfiguration, opportunities were opening. And it was important to tell the story about how Chicago was changing in order to tell the story about how both Barack and Michelle Obama saw development in relation to their young adult lives.
And I want to come back specifically to organizing, but I just want to ask you, David, as someone who covered and then was part of, well, not part of, but worked with Harold Washington. Can you describe with a little more color what it felt like in Chicago then and what?
Oh my. You know, one of the things that attracted me to Chicago, even a decade earlier when I came here as a student, was that it was the home of the last of the big city machines. As Adam suggests, it was an incredibly colorful environment. But it also, Hyde Park was sort of the locus of a budding Black independent political movement. When Mayor Daley died, there were two elections, a special election and a well, there were a series of three really. And I remember sitting down in that period with Leon Finney, who was active in the Woodlawn area, or later Reverend Finney. And I said to him, and when I was talking about politics, he said, I think there'll be a Black mayor in Chicago by 1983. And I said, really? That was almost a revolutionary idea. Mm-hmm. And he made it very clear that he thought he would be that mayor. But then we had Jane Byrne defeated the machine in 1979, and a lot of it had to do with affronts to the African American community, aggregated over time, but culminating in a series of storms, blizzards in which the city turned off transit service to the inner city and ran express trains to the suburbs and bypassed all the stops in the black community. And that was, black community, which had been a reliable source of votes to the Democratic machine, voted 2-1 for Jane Byrne, who almost immediately ended up doing a series of things that were even more egregious to the community. And by the time 1983 rolled around, she was very vulnerable. Richard M. Daley, Rich Daley, the son of the mayor, was poised to run. And there was an opportunity. And the community was very, very intent on fielding its own candidate. And there was only one person they wanted, which was Harold Washington, who was the congressman from this area. He had beaten the machine to win that seat. He was a former, he grew up in the Democratic machine. His father was a precinct captain. But Harold, who was, I see Tina here, knew him well. Really one of the most unusual people I've ever met. Just brilliant guy, pugnacious, streetwise. He had been in the machine. He rebelled against the machine, ran against the machine, won. And this was the choice. And I went to see Harold Washington during that period when he was contemplating running for mayor. And I met him at his headquarters, which was near the expressway. And he said, "What do you want?" Basically, I was a young reporter. And I said, "Well, I'm doing the scene setter on the mayor's race, and I want to know what you're doing, you know." And he said, "Can we talk off the record?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you know what it's like to be a congressman?" And I said, "Obviously not." And he said, "Well, they treat you like a king. You can come and go as you please. It's a pretty good job." He said, "Why would I ruin my life and for that?" And he said, "But the community is pretty insistent. And what I've decided to do is I'm going to tell them they have to register X number of voters and raise X amount of money by November 1st. And if they do, I will run. And if they don't, I won't." And I'm pretty sure they won't. But I'll at least have made a good faith effort here. Next time I saw him was when he was announcing for mayor. And he pulled me out of the press row and he said, I should have mentioned I was the City Hall bureau chief for the Tribune at the time. He pulled me out of the line and he said, "Remember that conversation we had?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "They did it, man." I said, "What was I going to do?" Now, it turns out that he loved it. He was great at it. I mean, he loved all of it, the theater of it. And he overwhelmed Byrne and Daley in that race. The community came together in a way that was historic and actually set the predicate for what Barack Obama would do 20 years later. And just to put a coda on this, 20 years later, when Washington ran, there was tremendous resistance to him then and throughout his years as mayor from the remnants of the white machine. And on the northwest side, he got 2% of the vote, I think. And 20 years later, when Obama ran, he carried, to our surprise, he carried every one but one of the northwest side wards. And I remember telling him on the night of the Senate primary in 2004 that Harold was smiling down on us that night. And Harold was really, we stood on his shoulders.
Yeah. I know you wanted to add one quick thing, but...
Very, very small thing. And I mean, I can't bring that color. I will bring this data point, which I think is always really powerful about thinking about Washington's election. We're used to now mayoral elections bringing out 30% of the electorate in Chicago, sometimes below that. Even toward the end of the late Daley senior administrations, the turnout was only about 55%. Daley Jr. would have something approaching 50 to 60%. The turnout for Harold Washington's election in 1983 was 80%, I'm pretty sure,
Yeah.
and the African American turnout was between 90 and 95%.
Wow.
And among other things, I think that also inspired Barack Obama to think about the power of organizing voters that led to his Project Vote work in 1992 that I think began to set ideas about how to reconfigure the electorate.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So back. Oh.
I just want to add one thing. Sorry about this. She knew what she was getting into when they invited me. But because this project and reading through my own conversation with you was so inspiring to me to remember those times. And I remember, and some of you remember, those blue sunrise buttons that were the Washington campaign buttons. And, there were people in the city who found that threatening. I thought it was, and I wrote a column about this for the Tribune about how inspiring it was that so many people, and principally African Americans in the city, were wearing this button. And it was a declaration that this is our city too, and we have a seat at the table. And it was a badge of pride. And when Barack Obama ran for president, I told my graphic designers I wanted a button, I wanted a logo that reflected that new beginning that campaign did. It was really, that turnout was one of the most inspiring things I've ever seen in politics.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. I don't have to ask you that question now. One of the things, Jerry Kellman, who was the man that hired Barack Obama as a young organizer, he said a lot of really interesting things. One of the things he said is that part of organizing is to teach people that power is not a dirty word. He also said that Obama was naive and inexperienced when he first started working with him. So there's a lot to be said, I think, about what President Obama learned as an organizer, but I think an interesting kind of note is that, and I'd like you to comment on this, one of the things he did was he had him go every Sunday to a different black church. And he said, Barack Obama, another important aspect of being an organizer is understanding diversity. He understood that. He grew up multiracial in very diverse communities of Hawaii and Indonesia, but he didn't understand the black public experience in America. And he learned that in the churches. Can you talk a little bit about the church culture? I can see steeples now. I guess one of them is Rockefeller Chapel, but can you talk a little bit about how that shaped?
Yeah, I mean, it is important that the initiative grew out also of a faith network of social change seekers, many of them in the Catholic Church, but they had strong relationships with a lot of the far South Side African American churches. I think maybe the simplest way to say this is that in communities that are historically divested, I mean, I'm taking a point among other people from W.B. Du Bois, in communities that are historically divested, faith leadership is often the equivalent of civic leadership. It's your chamber of commerce in some cases, it's your future planning committee, it's your group to try to draw people together and invest and believe in the future of their neighborhoods. And so I think there's a passion, even when sometimes, because congregations under economically difficult times, when people are in motion and moving around the city, congregations were actually in some cases decreasing in these black churches. But there was a sense that these were people who you could have conversations with to plan out an alternative future and ways to think differently about what might happen in these areas. And when I think about some of the projects that I recall being important in terms of DCP, trying to raise achievement among high school students in these areas, addressing asbestos abatement within the public housing that was based in Roseland, thinking again about the problem of trash disposal and seeking coalitions, among other things, with UNO, the group that came out of the Latin community that was really sort of spearheading some of this organizing under Danny Solis, among other people, back in the 1980s. I think there was just a sense that the Black church, again, was one more power center to pay attention to and learn about. And I think one of the things, as I'm thinking about your question and thinking about the project, is that becoming literate in a city like Chicago meant being able to take in multiple power centers and think about the different kinds of languages, the different sorts of postures, the different kinds of relationships that you had to cultivate in order to be able to work in these areas. And I think that he did start, certainly not by my judgment, but by the judgment of people that were his mentors and his partners. He did start green. He did start, in a sense, having to kind of go up a steep learning curve. But once you begin to recognize that these distinct power centers all need to be taken into account, you become actually quite well-versed in terms of thinking about how to get things done in a city.
Were you going to make a comment? No.
I mean, I could, but I'm not.
But yeah.
No, I agree with everything
What he
Adam
just,
said.
the other thing he said was that Barack Obama came wanting to be a fiction writer, and he always had a very strong sense of narrative, and that he describes it as almost kismet, David, that he ended up with you as a strategist, because you also have a strong sense of narrative and political narrative. So I'm going to skip ahead, and then I'm going to come back to Michelle. Can you talk about when you first met him and the narrative you saw, and did you already see the influence of Chicago, the time he'd spent as an organizer? Because I know that came to play in the campaign.
The answer to your second part is no. I've told this story a lot, and some of you may have probably heard it, but I got a call in 1992 from a woman, Betty Lou Saltzman, who some of you may know, who's a great sort of liberal activist in Chicago. And she said, I just met this most extraordinary young man, and I think you ought to meet him. And I said, well, I'm happy to meet anybody you want, Betty Lou, but why? And she said, I think he could be the first Black president of the United States. It's 1992. I always joke that I'd take Betty Lou to the track with me. But I met with him, and here's what I remember. I'll always remember this meeting. We had lunch, and he said, he was running a voter registration drive at the time, Project Vote, and to try and get participation on the west and south sides in the election. Probably helpful to both Carol Moseley Braun and to Bill Clinton. But he said, I want to be about something larger than myself. I want to be able to make a contribution, and I think, politics may be the way for me to do it. And I sat there and I thought, this guy had just been the president of the Harvard Law Review, and that was national news because there had never been an African-American president of the Harvard Law Review. And I knew that he could have written his own ticket at any corporation or law firm in America. Instead, he came back to Chicago to run a voter registration drive, and he, worked at a small labor and civil rights firm and was taught here. And the world of politics divides into two people. There's one cohort of people who run for office because they want to be somebody, be something. And there's another smaller and more admirable cohort of people who run for public office because they want to do something. And that's the impression that he's obviously very bright, and he was a delightful guy to chat with. But the strongest feeling I came away from is one of his motivation. And I was very impressed by that.
Well, and another reason he came back to Chicago, as we all know, was that the summer before, he'd been a summer associate, and he had met Michelle Robinson. So that also changed everything. You talk about power centers, I would say. That's a pretty strong one.
Definitely.
But, and again, I encourage you to read the childhood memories of Michelle. But Susan, can you talk about when you first met Michelle Obama and what you saw in her as a child of the South Side who was coming back to make a difference?
Well, When I met her was 1991 or 1992, and I was then the first assistant corporation counsel, which is the #2 position in the city corporation counsel's office, under the second Mayor Daley. And I had come from a corporate law firm, as others had, who took huge pay cuts because we wanted to do public service. And the general counsel of the University of Chicago, who's passed away then, Art Sussman, who had a lot of colleagues at Sidley, which was Michelle's law firm, sent me her resume, and it just said, and he said, she wants to do public service, something like that. So I interviewed her, and it's one of those events that really stood out. She was only 2 or 3 years out of law school. Her name was Michelle Robinson. She was engaged, but we didn't talk about the guy. I knew nothing about it, wasn't interested in it. She just, I mean, she's not only statuesque, I can still picture her in her sort of navy blue corporate suit. It was a, different era. And I tried to hire her really on the spot because she is so charismatic and impressive. And she said, I would like to do public service, but I think lawyers look at the world from too narrow a perspective, which is a debate she and I have had for decades, and she finally won, because she's right. But so I couldn't hire her, and I literally sent her resume to my colleague, Valerie Jarrett, who'd been in the Corporation Counsel's office, but was now a deputy mayor, and I said, she's leaving a law firm just like us. She's really impressive. You should meet her. And the rest is history. And I'll just tell you that because it's just sort of funny. Michelle said to Valerie, I'm interested in working for the city, but my fiance isn't quite sure. And Valerie said, and who is your fiance and why do we care? And they had dinner and the rest is history.
Another thing, that Jerry Kelman said, was that he learned about Black family from Michelle. And I wondered if you both know the family very well. You could comment on that and the identity, the family identity, the president found in Chicago and with Michelle, and how that concept of family shaped their leadership style.
I think, I'm sure we both can add to that. That was incredibly important. I think Barack Obama was already a child of the world, but didn't have a real base. And what he found in Michelle and her family was this incredibly lovely, close-knit family of 4. And, there's a famous story about how she brought him home, and Michelle's parents were like, nice guy, he'll never last. But she gave him a test, which was she asked her brother, Craig, this fantastic basketball player, if he would play with him. And Craig was like, oh my God, this guy's too nice, this isn't gonna happen. But in any event, what he did, what he saw, because they viewed basketball is just a way of showing your true character. And Craig was really impressed. It wasn't just that he was a good player, but that he believed in teamwork, he passed the ball, he wasn't just a showman. I don't know if you want to add.
Well, I want to combine 2 things here. Susan's absolutely right. And, some of this you can learn by reading his splendid memoir, which he, I think, shrewdly got out of the way when he was like in his early 30s, so he could get on with the rest of his work. He was, I often think about, and I've talked to him about it, because one of the things that struck me when I was working for him all those years was how centered and secure he seemed. And that seemed so odd to me because his father left him, his mother was away for long periods of time when he was a kid. And there was a kind of rootlessness to him. And he did find that in Chicago with the Robinson family. Michelle's father, I think, was a great role model for him, who fought through MS and went to his city job every day, and uncomplainingly, and just represented some just solid values. And you mentioned, the thing I wanted to combine was, you asked about his visiting these churches, but he sort of found his faith identity as well. He became a complete person here, and I think Michelle and her family had so much to do with it. And it was really, really formative. And interestingly, that was a choice he made. I mean, he chose the life he wanted. He chose the city. He chose and I think it made him the person. It's one of the things that made him the exceptional person that he is.
Yeah, Tim Black who has passed away, legendary figure in Chicago, said that Michelle and Barack together, and Mrs. Obama and President Obama together, so, but at the time they were Michelle and Barack, had a way of making each other, I guess, feel that they could do the impossible. I think he expressed it as the impossible. We do the impossible first, and then we work on the miraculous. Right. Allison Davis always said, that Obama was Black, but he was raised by a white mother and was never told he couldn't do things or go places in ways that young Black men are sometimes told. How, Adam, did you see that as something that sort of helped catapult them further in the context of Chicago, since we're talking about Chicago? Yeah. But it was a very unique community he found himself in. That basketball game, the friends that he made then, Craig's friends, he was friends with Marty, John Rogers, they stayed his friends throughout the presidency. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. No, I think in a way it really does go back to the power of finding a family, finding a home, and dare I say, finding a future, although I don't think that where that future was moving towards was entirely clear at that point. Let's remember that the whole premise of Black family and Black community was under extreme duress within the popular media, within universities and research centers, including in some cases the University of Chicago. People spoke of the crisis of the Black family. People spoke about ghetto concentrated poverty areas that were adjacent to many of the communities that the Obamas worked within and in some cases lived in. South Shore was beginning to kind of experience a decline as it went to being a predominantly Black community. I bring this up to say that leaning into the idea that within this home, this family, this marriage, Trinity Church was, I think, actually very important as well within that, were all of these success stories, all of these assets, all of these people who are excited about the community changing, becoming better, and in some cases also taking control of its own destiny. I think that was something that was particularly powerful at Trinity United Church when they were members there. And all of that was a way to provide a counter narrative to the presumption that one was living in a depreciated space and therefore one might have to adjust to a depreciated life. I think this was reality for many people who are African American, not because of what they were capable of, but because of what was told to them and pushed upon them. And I think there are all sorts of ways to kind of discard that narrative and say there's a very different story in terms of what they found around them and what they built together. So, I think for me, and I'm sort of thinking about many conversations with Tim Black in terms of, and that idea that the, the impossible we do immediately, the miraculous may take a little bit of time. That can-do sort of sense was, I think, a understory in Chicago and Black Chicago that was very important fuel and very significant to draw upon. And there are quite a few stories, and several of them I think are part of this friend group that assembled around them, that really give a sense that there was, for people who wanted to pay attention and slow down a bit in terms of consuming the normative media narrative and appreciate what was around in all of Chicago, that there was a sense that this was a wonderful place to try to build a life and plan futures, and ultimately to imagine futures for everybody within the city and ultimately elsewhere.
Yeah.
And just to go back to a previous point, the election of Harold Washington was one of those miraculous things that gave people a sense of possibility.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good segue, because clearly we're not going to be able to cover everything I wanted to cover, but we do have to talk about politics. Let's turn to Chicago politics and Illinois politics, really, because his first office was state senator. Can you talk about sort of the crucible of Chicago politics and Illinois politics and how that shaped him as a president?
Oh
David,
my, yeah. I mean,
in 10 words or less.
No, but we've gone through that. That's great.
Chicago was then, maybe less so now, but was then this incredible crucible when it came to politics. And as Adam sort of talked about before, on so many different levels, there were so many different elements of it. He got elected here from Hyde Park, and we don't have to go into the details of how that all came down, but this was, a progressive reform community. But he goes off to the legislature and he has to find his way in a place that didn't exactly operate under those rules. And he found mentors there, Emil Jones in particular, who would go on to become president of the Senate, who kind of tutored him in that. I think that was, and Emil was an old line kind of Chicago politician. I think he was a sewer inspector as well as a state senator, because it's always good to have a sideline. And but really was a wily player of power politics, and he mentored Barack in many ways and looked after him. And when Obama decided to run for the Senate, Emil Jones became an extraordinary asset to him, not just in lessons told, but also in bringing unions behind him and so on. So, and I will tell you this: way later in life, we were in Russia in 2009, and he went to meet Vladimir Putin, who was the prime minister. Then he took a little sabbatical and ran the country from that place. And the meeting was supposed to last for an hour, and it ended up going 2 because Putin spent the first hour in a monologue about all the indignities the West had heaped on Obama. And he came back, and I said, how was the meeting? How was it? He said, it's kind of like meeting with Mike Madigan. He said, the same cold blue eyes. He said, all business, But we often talked about different players that we met along the way in terms of characters that we knew in a previous life here in Chicago. So I think the lessons he learned there were really valuable. Also, one other thing, and maybe we'll talk about this. You talk about his ability. One of the great gifts of Obama was his ability to traverse lines, to feel comfortable in any room in which he happened into. And part of that was honed in his years in the legislature and his relationships with legislators from around the state, downstate folks, Republicans. He had a poker game in Springfield that became a place where Republicans and Democrats came together, and to hear him tell it where he could remove their money from them. But but it also was something that helped him hone skills that would be really important later.
Yeah, you could, I remember going downstate with him and then being in Iowa with him. It was those same skills of being able to talk to farmers and being able to talk. Adam, for you, Illinois politics was not your field. So what did you take away from some of the interviews you did with the Illinois politicians? And
Well, I think with Emil Jones, there was that sense of a long-running, very intricate mentorship and probably apprenticeship that culminated with his becoming very important as a point person from about 2002 to 2004 in terms of leading bills, bringing them to the floor, passing legislation, having a record that was quite compelling in terms of what he had learned and done in state politics. And it ingratiated him strategically. Like, I remember the poker game as being interesting because a number of the Republicans were Collier County Republicans near Cook County. And that proved to be incredibly important in 2004 in relation to his primary run. But there was also, all of the contacts that he was able to make downstate. And I remember that several times. It was partly reading, and then it was partly the way that this would come up again and again in interviews, that the brand of politics that was accessible outside of Chicago that had to do with the state was also attractive to Barack Obama. It spoke to the ways in which he could claim roots back to Kansas, and he grew up with white grandparents in Honolulu, and basically was able to be someone who could step across barriers, which was incredibly powerful. And increasingly, I think in terms of, David could correct me, I'm sure, the focus group work that was done in the early stages of the election, people were excited about the idea that this is someone who can talk in many different rooms.
Yeah, particularly in a very, very divisive time. So that was super appealing.
Yeah. But there was also a kind of clear focus point in terms of thinking of this narrative around downstate politics, and that was the legacy of Paul Simon. Paul Simon was a figure who had been a revered reformer. He was a journalist before he became a politician. He was someone who embodied, in many people's minds, a kind of integrity and a stubbornness in terms of challenging and confronting the way that state politics operated. And there was a point where many people, began to become connected with Barack Obama as he was beginning to think about the possibility of pursuing, different offices after the setback, which perhaps we can talk about, perhaps not, of the election in 2000 with Congressman Rush. But Paul Simon actually took an interest, and I think he was one of the first people to say, your future may not be in Chicago, your future may be statewide. And, constantly conveying this sense that that might be a lane that opens up that he would be uniquely equipped to be able to move forward with. And I wouldn't go on this story because David was in the room multiple times with this, but tying his legacy to the legacy of Paul Simon while alive, and then afterwards as a kind of blessing and laying upon of hands after the death of Paul Simon, was something that was also very, very powerful. And I think gave people a sense that other people besides, the tough, battle-tested, street-smart Chicagoans were really excited about this person. Yeah. And they saw a future for him, but they also saw a future in terms of breaking through the divisiveness, the lines, the kind of compartments that people were working in.
I was Paul Simon's campaign manager in 1984 and was talking to him throughout the Obama campaign in 2004. And he really loved Barack, but he had other connections to people in the race. It took a long time to persuade him to get involved in a primary, and he called me at the end of that, around Thanksgiving, and he said, "I've made my decision. I want to help Barack, and whenever you want." And I said, "Let's wait till January when the campaign's it'll be," because we knew we needed to get these northern suburbs and Oak Park and places. And Paul Simon was like a god with these voters. Mm-hmm. So we were really excited to have him. He was the most important endorsement to us. And then he went in for heart surgery and he passed away before he was able to give that endorsement. As you know, we talked about this. We ended up doing an ad with his daughter in which she talked about Simon and Obama as being cut from the same cloth. And it was really, it was an endorsement from the grave, essentially, and probably was one of the elements that led to what turned out to be a landslide victory.
So clearly, there are a lot of factors. You all please start thinking of your questions, because we're going to go to questions soon, so we're going to skip over the setback. I'm
sure it will come up in questions.
It could come up.
The troubles.
The troubles. But I want to go back to Michelle for a moment, and because here we are at University of Chicago, and she has a very real legacy here as the founder of UCSC and her work at the hospital. And Susan, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what Michelle brought to the community just through sheer force of will and her dedication and nature.
Excuse me, I think after Leah was born, Michelle was working at Public Allies and called and asked if I would make an introduction because she was thinking of working at University of Chicago. So I called the same person who was still at the university, and I said, I'm going to return the favor. Michelle would like to do something in the Dean of Students office, and was hired first on the university side. And her whole way of dealing with the community of which she was a part was that it should be very symbiotic. So instead of just having people come to the university, she wanted to have students volunteering in the community, and that's what she started there. And then after Sasha was born, I was over at the medical center as general counsel, and the CEO asked if I would take on also community and legal affairs. And I said, well, for community affairs, sure, but we have to hire Michelle Obama. And she was off on maternity leave, and this was the furthest thing from her mind. And I just kept calling her. And small world, Valerie was on the board at that point, and she would call her, and we just kept saying, you could really make a difference, even more of a difference at the medical center. And she had mixed feelings because as a member of the community growing up, she felt that there were invisible walls that separated the South Side community from the hospital. And we kind of convinced her that this is where she could really make a difference because she really understood where people were coming from. And one of the things that she taught all of us at the medical center was to put ourselves in the shoes of people in the community so that we would appreciate some of the cultural differences and reasons for people not wanting to use the medical center. So when she started, there was one other employee in community affairs, and when she left, there were 17. And it's all because of the tremendous work she did. She said that we have these brilliant researchers who are going out into the community doing good research, but that should not be the way the community first sees the University of Chicago. There has to be trust built. So, we had the volunteer program, which basically had, 50 elderly people helping volunteer in the medical center. And she said, this has to be both ways. So she got hundreds and hundreds of doctors, nurses, staff at the medical center to participate in community activities, to volunteer. We had a caravan going around. We would go to to go to churches and emphasizing the importance of continuing care, those kinds of things. And then the thing that I think made the hugest difference which was particularly courageous on her part, was that we realized that a good third to a half of the people who came to our emergency room really didn't need emergency care. They needed continuing care because they had chronic conditions, but they didn't have medical homes. And we thought of starting a program. And this is particularly courageous because the presidential campaign had started, and she was still working part-time at the medical center. And she said, this is really important work. I'm going to take this on. So we hired, under her supervision, a bunch of social workers in the emergency room, and while people were waiting, and there were long waits, they would approach patients and say, do you have a medical home? Would you like a medical home? Would you like us to help you get an appointment in the community for continuing care? And that program still exists to this day. The Community Service Center at the university continues to this day. So, and I think it just had its 25th anniversary. So she has made a lasting impact on both sides of the university.
Yeah. Thank you for that, because I think there's so much work that students and staff do at this university that they don't realize comes from that. And clearly she continued, and you did it in her work as First Lady.
Well, there are aspects of the Affordable Care Act that have her name on it.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
We're going to go to questions. I'm going to ask one more question of the panel, and then we're going to go to questions. So there are microphones. There will be a microphone in the back, so please line up in the middle. So this is the last question for all of you. I want your 2 cents. It was very interesting that two of the oldest and both now no longer with us participants, Tim Black and Newt Minow, emphasized how much work is still to be done. There are many great achievements, but as we all know, the arc of the moral universe is long. And the wisdom of old age would seem to suggest that you can never stop trying to bend it. In fact, Newt said, my main hope is that they're not done. Can each one of you pick one thing that you want to highlight? It could be the work of the foundation, the Obamas individually, that shows this commitment to the work still to be done, and what we can take away from this project or from their legacy that helps us all kind of continue the work. And if you don't want to talk about the work, you can talk about backlash, but let's keep it positive.
All right, let me just start, because I see Tina here from the foundation, and she would shoot me if I didn't say something about the great work that they're doing.
Let me move my chair over.
It's, you may not have heard enough about what the Obama Foundation is doing already, but I think the single most important thing that they've already started doing, and there's going to be a lot more of it when that building that's right over there is finished in a couple years, training future leaders, giving them the tools that they need to go and change the world. And I think that that's something that both Obamas feel very strongly about, and I think that's something positive that will continue.
Yeah, just adding on to that, the most important legacy should be the legacy of hope and possibility, because we live in such cynical times, and people need to be reminded that change does happen. Sometimes we take a couple of steps back, but the Affordable Care Act is a great example. I run into people all the time whose lives were saved by that, only because of the determination of President Obama, maybe animated by some of the lessons that he learned here in the streets of Chicago, that Michelle taught him from her own experience. That became something that will change the lives of millions of people for a time immemorial, and we just need to keep reminding new generations that that change is possible, and that we shouldn't surrender to cynicism.
Well, being the furthest away from the Obamas, I do this with caution, but I think both of them, and this came up time and again when we did the interviews, were highly principled people, deeply idealistic people, but also people who leaned into practical, pragmatic solutions to difficult problems. And they were confident and patient and had the sufficient stamina to see incremental advances as something to build upon. And I think just that practical spirit, which I really do feel is also a bit in the DNA of this city, that there are many problems, and there continue to be problems that in some cases mirror national and global problems, and in some cases are quite unique to this space. But one of the things also I think that was really changing was people beginning to think from foundations to academia to grassroots organizing, to policy making, to media content and generation, just how to kind of frame what people were trying to change about their society in very practical terms. And so I think that what I hear and see and read about what is being built up in terms of thinking about a legacy project is never to forget that rootedness within a practical method and practical resources. And I think that's also a way to kind of calm the waters and discipline people from following their most extreme passions and remind everybody that there are problems to be solved.
Yeah.
And we need to find ways to actually address them forthrightly and in a sustained fashion. And I feel like that continues to be something as a style of politics and public leadership, which both of them share.
And I think the foundation, that those are some of the principles that the foundation is inculcating
Right.
leaders from around this country and around the world within, and it's too rare these days. We've become absolutists, and the fact is that's not the way change happens. The Affordable Care Act is not a perfect instrument, but it was the best that we could do, and it's made an enormous difference, and we have to remember that's how change is accomplished in a democracy.
Yeah. And I think it's something all you students can think about in your summer internships. Do we have a question? Yeah.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. My name is Anand. I'm a first-year Masters in Public Policy student. I'm from India. For us, for international students, the first image and influence of President Obama, the way he was introduced to us through his groundbreaking oratory and rhetoric. So I just want to know that as a city of Chicago, who has its own traditions, diverse traditions of rhetoric, discussions, oratory from Black Christian traditions, Muslim traditions, labor unions, labor movement, how that ecosystem shaped President Obama's oratory and rhetorical approach, and how his experience at Chicago Law School shaped his legal mind, which we could see and observe in his time in presidency. Thank you.
That's an interesting question, a hard one to answer. I might sort of defer a little bit on the law school as a shaper of him, if only because I think there were so many different sources around thinking about legal practice and changing legal doctrine. The law school and his teaching was important, but his work within Judson Minor was important. His conversations, some of which happened in kind of think tanks organized around various areas of legal thought, including at Harvard, were important. So there is a kind of wide set of sources. The oratory question is fascinating. Obviously, you're correct that there's a long, rich tradition of thinking about public speaking, addresses as ways to frame issues, suggest avenues to solutions, make clear your distinct principles and stand. And so I'm thinking about that speech in 2002 in relation to the Iraq War here at Daley Plaza. And how important that was as an exercise of saying, I'm going to take a different road. At that moment, in terms of the votes within Congress, it was a lonely road. But this is the road that makes sense, and these are the reasons, very pragmatic, as I recall that speech, for taking that route. And that was an inoculation in relation to the 2008 election against having any connection to the legacy, which was worsening by the day of the Iraq War.
But at the time that he made that speech,
it was unclear.
It was not at all clear that was
Right.
the right political decision. And he said, this is what I believe and this is what I think I should say. And we should point out, it was sort of lightly covered. It was done at a small rally at the
Yes.
federal building before the vote to authorize the war. And as I told you when we met, years later when he was running for president, I searched high and low for a video of it. And this was a speech that he wrote on his own the night before this rally, and he talked about that he feared a war of undetermined cost, undetermined consequences, undetermined length that would unleash sectarian forces in Iraq that would be hard to control. I mean, everything he said in that speech turned out to be true. And this guy was a state senator from Illinois. There are a lot of smart people in Washington who got to that a lot later.
Yeah. Yeah. So no, that obviously, of course, the speech at the convention, the Democratic National Convention in 2004. Maybe the only thing that might be, or a thing that would be helpful to take, is to think about the distinct styles of these speeches. I've always, for instance, thought of that speech in Boston as a reboot of a kind of immigration story in terms of, speaking about global roots and global confluences, but coming back to the idea that only in America is this story, my story, possible. Very different speech that he gave in relation to the war in 2002. And then other addresses, including, the famous speech after the controversies with Reverend Wright about how to think about a history in relation to race, how to think from his perspective about a future in relation to a multiracial America. Each of these were distinct, and so I think it says something about the breadth and the consultation of many different models that he drew upon.
But you, Adam, said something earlier that's really important. Well, a couple of things that are to be noted. One is, I think that the exposure to the churches in Chicago had a lot to do with at least one element of his speech making in some of the venues in which he spoke. But you talked about he's a storyteller. And he always understood the power of a story. I always felt like when I was in a room with him, he was of the scene, and he was watching the scene and absorbing the scene, and was able to internalize that, and it would then show up in his rhetoric. So I don't know that was a Chicago quality. I think that was developed before he got to Chicago, but I think Chicago and his experiences in Illinois provided many of the stories that animated his speeches moving forward.
Yeah, and it comes from organizing as well. Next question. We're going to try and get through all the questions, so I'm going to speed you guys along.
Hi there, my name's RJ. I'm an outgoing senior at the college here at UChicago, and I'm a member of the Student Advisory Board here at the Institute. I'm curious, ever since I've been politically conscious, the Obamas have been a symbol of idealism and of progress and real symbols of exceptional political characters. And I'm curious now because we're facing a presidential election where it seems that we're stuck with two very, very old, some folks would say verging on senile folks. And there seems to be a leadership gap between this older generation and the younger folks that the Obama Foundation is working with, folks that are beside me, in my classrooms, that are really going to start coming into those younger, lower political offices soon. So I'm guessing, why are we facing that? Why is there no 30-something Obama exceptional character out there that is rising to the challenge? And where should we be searching for those characters in the future?
Susan, I think you want to
First of all,
The mic is getting hotter.
let me set aside some of your characterizations, and let me set aside how we got here. The important thing is that there are inspirational young leaders all over this country. And, the one thing I would say is we should get the hell out of the way and give them their chance. So I don't know whether those weren't even young people clapping. But don't doubt that. There are governors and mayors and members of Congress who are deeply, deeply inspiring and who are just waiting for an opportunity. And because of circumstances of the two nominees who had the ability to preempt that transition in this election, we're going to have to wait. But the worst thing would be for you or any young person to walk away because you feel like we've decided that this is the best we can do. We know we can do. We know there's a new generation of leadership waiting to come, and that leadership change is going to happen. And you guys should be a part of it.
We don't have that long to wait.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's the one thing about folks being old is there'll be a transition.
So my name is Rael Jackson. I represent Real Men Cook. Very South Side. Michelle grew up a block over from my grandparents. She went to the same grammar school as my mother. Went to the same high school as me when young. I went to Trinity as well. And then you spoke to the power centers of the Obamas, whereas, Barack was very accessible at one point in time. He had participated in Real Men Cook a few times. And then I remember in 2004, when he became at the Congressional Black Caucus, and I saw like the long line to get into his party. I was like, oh, he's gone. We'll never have access to him again. And then again with Trinity and, the cutting off from Reverend Wright, I'm just curious, how do you believe like that bubble sort of has affected him or shifted him in such a way? And what changes have you seen since he's sort of been cut off from a lot of the that mindset, that intellectualism of Black America, post Reverend Wright, post 2004 as senator?
Yes.
Well, I can start, but again, I can't say anything about what was actually happening 2008 in terms of his access. I think these questions of succession and politicians or public leaders potentially transforming, or why we have what appears to be a gerontocracy, part of it is that transitions and succession is incredibly hard. Incredibly hard. For instance, at Trinity, we wound up interviewing Otis Moss. And the reason why we did this was because we got advice from multiple members of the congregation that an important part of the story of how that sort of transpired, that rupture between Reverend Wright and Barack Obama, was a prolonged, protracted, and somewhat messy succession process of transitioning away from the pulpit. It's understandable, people want to be somebody in public leadership. They want to stay somebody in public leadership, so they stay around. But I think that one thing I would say is to have a very wide sense of how we talk about leadership and organization of opinion in any community. Barack Obama and Michelle Obama, as I understand it, remained in touch with a number of leaders, but a number of people that they had had connections with, most prominently Reverend Wright, that proved difficult to sustain in the context of that year of the election. And there's been many, many, obviously, analyses and examinations of that. But I do think it's important to keep context about the other people that there was kind of continued relationships with, continued connections with. I think the other thing, and I really would defer to both Susan and David on this, is that maintaining connection with someone who comes to the presidency is not often a one-to-one, face-to-face type of process. But intermediaries prove to be very important. People who could find ways to open up channels so that messaging gets communicated becomes very important. And I suppose that some of what may come out of this larger oral history project, but also the ongoing debate, because it is going to be a debate, about how to understand the popular assessment of the legacy of this presidency versus the way in which the legacy is constructed internally. That's healthy. That's important in order for us to continue to learn what we can from one another. One of the things that's going to be revealed, I think, is the kind of intricacy in which people were able to remain in touch in spite of the fact that it was difficult, indeed impossible, for people to be face to face. And some of that is just the physics of how power operates within the United States. And workarounds are important rather than kind of getting rid of the whole structure.
To that point, one of the first things that President Obama did was he asked that every single day he get 10 letters from that are representatives of the letters that were coming in, and he'd get 40, 50,000 a day, but they would oftentimes be on similar themes, and he would read those letters faithfully, and he would talk to us about those letters, and he would communicate with the people who wrote them, and those letters would often animate how he approached issues. And he did that because he understood that the White House is like working in a submarine, and you look at the world through a periscope, and it's very hard to get a feel for what's actually going on. And he also maintained his relationships with a lot of friends from the past, and it was our job also as staff to keep him connected. But there was an awareness that the danger of the presidency is to be subsumed by it and overwhelmed by the echo chamber of Washington, which is very, very loud and often very wrong. Gary Hart, who ran for president in the 80s, once told me that don't forget, Washington's always the last to get the news. And that was a profound statement, and Obama understood that. And then the last thing I'd say is Michelle was always, oftentimes meetings would start with, I was talking to Michelle last night, and she had this ability to bring to the conversation sort of how normal families were thinking about stuff and how she refreshed herself. You can speak to that, but she, often put it in the context of her experience on the south side of Chicago and her parents and how they would process things. So this goes to your point, Adam. There are a lot of workarounds. It can be a withering exercise to try and stay in touch.
And frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the main thing Michelle did was not watch any news on TV, no cable, no nothing. She really, as you said, she just had this natural ability to understand how sort of normal people were thinking, which often informed what we did. But when you talked, I was thinking that when the university made a bid for the presidential library, we had 13, 15, something like that, community meetings. And one of the things that was really sort of gratifying, enlightening, was the number of people who stood up, sort of like you, and said, I was here on Hyde Park Boulevard or on 53rd Street, and I signed Obama's first petition when he ran for state senator. And so many people had a personal stake, which is why they were so enthusiastic actually about the presidential center coming here. I think it's a little bit easier for Michelle because the bubble isn't quite as extreme as it is for the president. And she has the ability to maintain friendships with people from way, way back. And just one really quick anecdote, when a longtime friend of hers passed away, whose name I'm blocking out right now, and the funeral was at Trinity, and this was many years after the whole incident with Reverend Wright. Reverend Moss said, "Will everyone stand who is a member of this congregation?" And Mrs. Obama stood up. So it said to me and to everyone in the room, including Reverend Moss, who mentioned it in the interview, that even though there was they didn't necessarily weren't able to stay connected, there was something in her heart that was.
Yeah.
We should also mention that the president flew his barber from 53rd Street out, got his hair, and I don't know, the haircuts weren't that exceptional. And I always got the feeling that he wanted to talk to him because you want to find out what's going on in the neighborhood.
Every
talk to
reason.
the barber.
Yep,
Yeah.
That's right.
All right, we've got one last question. I did want to just put a point on the letters. Those have been published, so while you're waiting for the archives to be online. You can read the letters. Caden, last question.
Hi again. I know like the name of the panel is How Chicago Shaped Barack and Michelle Obama, and we focused on them as a couple, like really, I guess they're also a couple too, but just thinking about their role as like parents and like raising like resilient young women and whatnot, and like what role the Black family has in creating young, independent Black people. So, yeah.
Well, these guys are thinking big thoughts. I want to tell you one little anecdote that was from your interview with Newt Minow that I hadn't known about. This is someone who a very prominent Chicago lawyer who hired Barack as a law student because his daughter was a professor at Harvard Law School and said, you've got to hire this guy, and that's why he did. When then U.S. Senator Obama was debating about whether he should or would run for U.S. president, he called Newt Minow and he said, can I have lunch with you and Ab Mikva, who also, lifelong friend of Newt Minow, but also was a very, very prominent, not only Chicagoan, but national leader. And the three of them had lunch together. And then U.S. Senator Obama said, I have one question I want to talk to you about. You both have three fantastic daughters. You each have three fantastic daughters. And Newt said, yes, 5 lawyers and a rabbi. And he said, what I want to know is, you've been in public life, you've had these incredible careers. How did you stay being a good father? And if I run for president, will this hurt my ability to be a good father to my daughters? Because this is something I care about more than anything else. And we've talked about his own background and not having a father who was there. And somehow they convinced him that it made more sense to run when he was young because his children needed him, his daughters, who are amazing, would need him more when he was older. And that's one of the reasons he agreed to run.
Well, the other thing.
And he also said, oh yeah.
I'm sorry, go.
No, you can say it.
I was going to say, oh, go ahead.
We're going to say the same thing.
We are?
Yeah, pretty sure.
Okay, well then say it.
Okay, and then he also said the great thing about being president is that you live above the store, so you can have dinner with the kids every day.
That is true. I will say, he took a lot of heat in Washington because he didn't go out and socialize at night and he didn't show up at parties and so on because he had a sacrosanct date with his family every night and for dinner. And when he was in town and worked with his daughters on their schoolwork and engaged them and so on. And I think of all the achievements of the Obamas, one of the most impressive to me is that in that hothouse of a town and in that really weird environment, they managed to raise 2 exceptional and very normal in a way kids. And that's a tribute to Michelle, to Barack, to Mrs. Robinson, who came out and lived with them. But they took, a lot of politicians talk about family, but they took this very, very seriously. And it's a great reflection on them.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank our panelists, both for...
And our moderator.
Oh,
And our moderator.
I do want to, I mean, the work of the Oral History Project is incredible, and it will be really wonderful when it's released. And I want to thank you all for being a great audience. And one more event, the Institute of Politics next Friday?
Friday, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to find out all about 2024.
About the gerontocracy, as Adam
The first one.
So thank you all.
And I'm part